force major into three aspects, that is commercial contracts, labor laws, and real estate. I'm thankful to CA Paras Savla, the past president of Chamber of Tax Consultants, who has agreed to join us and also who has agreed to lead the session. So we'll have a very good advantage of his knowledge and experience when it comes to commercial contracts and also labor laws from the perspective of a chartered accountant. Friends, we'll begin the session. I'll just introduce our three speakers first. The first speaker is Kingshuk Banerjee. He is a partner disputes resolution at Khaitan & Co. He is a qualified solicitor registered with the Bombay Incorporated Law Society, and he has got over a decade of experience in the legal profession, and he specializes in diverse commercial and contractual disputes. And he's going to cover the aspect of force majeure from the point of commercial disputes in commercial contracts. Our next speaker is Mr. Harsh Parikh. He is also partner at Khaitan & Co. And he is partner in the real estate and private client practice group. He specializes in property matters, including acquisition and title diligence. He advises on warehousing, logistics projects, IT parks, and various redevelopment projects, such as SRA projects, MHADA projects, and projects under DCR 33-7, MIDC land and MMRDA lands. He also has expertise in drafting and negotiating transactions documents such as joint development agreements, development management agreements, agreement for sale, conveyance deeds, lease deeds, partition agreements, license agreements, business conducting agreements, etc. Going to the third speaker, who is going to cover the labor laws, is Advocate Anshul Prakash. Of course, he is also partner with Khaitan & Co. In the corporate and commercial practice group. He specializes in employment and labor laws and heads the firm's employment, labor, and benefit laws. He has advised various prominent domestic and international clients on issues related to employment in respect of labor law compliance, labor audits, transfer and relocation of employees pursuant to business transfers and asset sale, purchase, workforce policy and benefits, stock options, maternity benefits, drafting of employment contracts across levels, including senior managerial, personal, human resource, and personal policy. He has represented several multinational companies like Merck & Co., Total SA, Otsuka Pharmaceutical Factories, Johnson Hopkins University, and several other companies. He has also, he is continuously contributing to various publications and presentations. He has contributed to the report on future of work as part of collaboration between International Bar Association and International Labour Association, and presented the first working draft at ILO headquarters in Geneva. The Indian chapter of Global Legal Insights to Employment and Labour Law 2019, the Indian chapter of Employment and Labour Law, Jurisdictional Comparisons, published by Thomson Reuters, the Indian chapter of Employment and Labour Law, Jurisdictional Comparisons 2014 and 2012, published by Thomson Reuters and Sweet and Maxwell. Led by Anshul, the employment, labor and benefits practice at the firm has been ranked as Tier 1 by Legal 500 Asia Pacific in 2017, 2018, 2019 and 2020, and won the IDEX Employment Law Firm of the Year 2019 award. With this, friends, I have introduced all the three speakers. I would also like to introduce our session moderator, CA Paras Savla. Of course, as far as the CA fraternity goes, Paras does not require any introduction. However, I'll just give a brief introduction. He is the past president of the Chamber of Tax Consultants. He is a chartered accountant, CFE USA, DISA, ICI, insolvency professional, registered valuer, securities and financial assets. He advises in the areas of corporate tax, corporate reorganization, inbound and outbound investment strategies, corporate finance, debt solutions, transaction support system for both buy and sell side, mandates, pre-deal evaluation, tax due diligence, strategic analysis and benchmarking, financial analysis and valuation. Friends, he is constantly contributing to various professional journals, and he's all very frequently featured in various newspapers like Economic Times and Times of India DNA for his perspective on various taxation amendments which come from time to time. With this, friends, I have introduced all the three speakers and also the session moderator. Now I request the session moderator and the three speakers to take the session forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rahul, for introducing the speaker and also kind words about me. We also like to thank Gautam Chamburkar and Vinita Krishnan from the Khaitan who have helped organizing and connecting us with these all three speakers. And with this, may I request the speakers Kinshuk to take it further.
Sure, Paras Bhai, and thank you very much to the CTC team, Paras Bhai, Rahul, all of you for inviting us and really giving us this opportunity to share our thoughts on the subject. So as I think Rahul mentioned, I will be talking about force majeure in the commercial contracts context generally. My partner Harsh will be touching upon real estate, and Anshul, of course, will be dealing with the employment aspects. Paras Bhai, can we move to the next slide, please? Yeah, we can move to the next one. So I think most of us, as Rahul mentioned, force majeure has been a topic that everybody's been talking about. I think most lawyers have been answering questions with respect to force majeure. We've been both attending and speaking at various webinars, and really by now, I think most of us are very, very familiar with the subject. So I will not take too much time on the theoretical aspects. What I will do is try and give a general overview, really from a practical perspective. Over the past few weeks, we've been receiving a lot of queries from clients, all kinds of queries, very interesting queries. And really what we'll try and do over the next few minutes is summarize the answers to all these queries that have cropped up over the past few weeks. But before I start discussion on force majeure, I think it's important to lay the foundation very clearly. And really the foundation to the discussion on force majeure is really what a contract is, and really what the law expects parties to a contract to really do. And really it's stating the obvious, but law expects that the parties fulfill their obligations under the contract. And I think that's important. When you start a discussion around force majeure, it's important to first lay that foundation and lay emphasis on the fact that come what may, parties are expected to fulfill their obligations under the contract. But really, given the situation that we have been in over the last few weeks and months in some cases, it has become difficult for many of us to fulfill our obligations under the contract. And really, that's where the force majeure clause comes into play. Broadly speaking, I should clarify that force majeure is really a contractual concept. It's a creature of contract. There is the doctrine of frustration under Indian law, but force majeure per se is a contractual matter. It's a provision that you find in contracts which excuses parties really from performing obligations under certain circumstances. While I've given, we've set out the definition of force majeure really there, what Black's Law Dictionary, has to say about force majeure. But I should say that, look, what force majeure means to each of us will depend on really the language of the contract and the language in the contract. We can move to the next slide. So I think one question that arises, especially amongst the non-legal community for whom this subject is new, is, how do we deal with a situation like this? Look, we know there is a contract, we know we have to perform, but we are not able to perform. And really, what do we do? Please tell us a little about this force majeure and how do we approach this systematically, and is there some way? And really, what we've been doing is trying to approach this matter systematically and making things as easy as possible. And what we've been recommending is that, look, approach it in a sort of question answer format, and ask yourself 4, I think, crucial, important questions. And really the answers to this will determine whether a claim for force majeure is tenable or not. First, I think the most important question, does my contract have a force majeure clause? Because if my contract does not have a force majeure clause, really, uh, um, there is no scope for invoking a force majeure claim. You may still have recourse to the general law of frustration under the Contract Act, but we'll come to that a little later. But there is no possibility of then making a claim of force majeure. So that's important to understand. The next question that you need to ask yourself, particularly in the given context, is, does the definition of force majeure in my contract include an epidemic, or does it include a pandemic? Does it use the expression government action, order, or lockdown? Because really these are the events, so to say, that are impacting performance. It's the epidemic that is impacting performance. In some cases, it's the government lockdown. In fact, in most cases, it's the government lockdown. And really what we need to see is, does my definition specifically refer to this kind of an event? But it doesn't end there, because your definition may have pandemic or epidemic or government order mentioned. But it's important to correlate the event with your obligation that you're not able to perform. So the next question is, do these events impede or prohibit or prevent performance of my obligations? So how does the epidemic prohibit performance of my obligation? Does it prohibit performance of my obligation? Similarly, does the government lockdown directly impact my performance? So that's the next question. And finally, is there something that I could have done to really mitigate that impact, to dilute the impact? Because as I mentioned in the beginning, you're expected as a party to a contract to fulfill your obligations under any circumstances. And therefore, if there is something that we can do to really mitigate the impact, prevent the impact, the courts will expect us to do just that. So really, to answer, if the answers to the first three questions there on your screen is yes, and the answer to the last one is no, I think in 9 out of 10 cases, you may have a tenable force majeure claim. But really things are not as straightforward as that. You could be, number one, faced with a situation where you don't have a force majeure clause in your contract. And we'll discuss the doctrine of frustration, which then may become applicable a little later. But in my next slide, what I propose to do is try and analyze the various kinds of definitions of force majeure that you may be faced with, specifically in the context of, in a situation where your definition does not have pandemic, epidemic, or government action expressly included. And what we've seen in our experience is, and this is really at the cost of generalization, but really what we've tried to do here is categorize the definition of force majeure into three broad sort of categories. The one that you see on your left, the left of your screen, number one, is a very wide, inclusive definition, but very generally worded. If you have a definition like this in your contract, it's possible to make an argument that, look, government lockdown or the epidemic for that matter is included in the definition. Similarly, you could have a situation where your definition is exhaustive. What do I mean by exhaustive? It's the direct opposite of inclusive. So you have the third column on your screen, a definition which specifically lists out certain events and describes certain events as being force majeure events. And really, if you have a definition like this in your contract, there is no room for interpretation. I have given examples of both. One is an inclusive general one, and one is a exhaustive one. But really, somewhere in the middle, you have a definition which is both inclusive, but at the same time lists out certain specific events. And really, the problems that we foresee as lawyers will arise if you have a definition like this in your contract. Because if you have a definition like this, there is a room for debate, there is a room for argument, and obviously one will have to wait and see how courts will respond. But really, our analysis of jurisprudence both in India as well as outside India seems to suggest that in this kind of a case, courts will apply what in legal terms is called the ejusdem generis principle. And really, what does that mean? But to understand that, I think we'll just go through the illustration that you have in the center of your screen at the bottom. So force majeure means and includes lightning, earthquake, tempest, cyclone, flood, volcanic eruptions, war, strikes, and all other events beyond the reasonable control of and not attributable to the affected party. So the underlying portion is what I refer to and what lawyers refer to as the catch-all provision. And really one is to read just the underlying portion. Perhaps one would say that, look, this covers everything under the sun. But that's where this principle of ejusdem generis comes in. And really what we've seen in these scenarios is courts interpreting this underlined section by reference to the words that precede the underlined portion. What do I mean by that? So let's assume for a moment that your performance is affected by a tsunami, just by way of example. Tsunami is not specifically listed there, and really courts will, in 9 out of 10 cases, if not all cases, say that, look, tsunami is akin to a flood, a cyclone, and therefore really is included in the definition. Let's assume your performance is impacted by a terrorist act. Again, not an event that is included in the definition, but it's similar to a warlike situation, and courts may really say that, look, it is deemed to be included. It's possible to make an argument that a pandemic or an epidemic or a government action really does not fit into any of those events that are specifically listed, and therefore the catch-all provision at the end should not be extended to those. Having said that, it's a matter of argument, and really one will have to wait and see how things evolve. One common question that everybody asks is, act of God. Why can't act of God include, a pandemic or an epidemic? Again, one will have to wait and see how the courts in India really approach this situation. But jurisprudence seems to suggest that epidemics and pandemics, which really one can't say there is no human intervention at all or human agency involved at all, really wouldn't fall within the definition of act of God, which is understood to be an event that has no sort of connection with any form of human agency or intervention. Having said that, I should also point out that when the Spanish flu hit the United States of America in I think early 1900s, in 1918, various courts, different courts in the US really construed a act of God definition differently. There were courts which said that a pandemic, epidemic is an act of God, whereas there were other courts which said that no, it is not an act of God. So really one will have to wait and see how this evolves. We can move to the next slide, where what we've tried to do is really discuss some other considerations when you're looking at a force majeure clause or dealing with a force majeure situation. And I think the first and the most important one is often what we miss is, do look out for exclusions and exemptions in your force majeure clause. So you could have a force majeure clause which specifically lists out certain events, as we saw in the previous slide. You could also have a definition which expressly excludes some force majeure events. I mean, we've seen contracts over the last few weeks where pandemic and epidemic surprisingly are excluded. So look out for those exclusions. You could also have a situation where specific obligations are excluded. So you could have payment obligations, for instance, that are excluded. You could have various other obligations also that may be potentially excluded. Recommendation is that don't restrict your analysis to only the force majeure clause or the definition. Please look at the contract in its entirety. Look at the entire contract really to come to a conclusion on whether you can claim force majeure or not. Next question that often has been arising is, what about past obligations? What if an obligation to make payment has already accrued? Can a party really say that, look, because of the force majeure event, I will now not make payment? And really, even at the cost of sort of answering this generally, the rule would be that force majeure events will not really impact or excuse past performance. It will really have implications in the future. Having said that, one would have to see the content of the contract. But generally speaking, I think in most contracts, past obligations will be excluded either expressly or by implication. Finally, and this is a very important point, especially in the prevailing circumstances, a lot of us are not able to perform our obligations because it's become commercially unviable for us to perform, or it is inconvenient. I mean, either we don't have employees coming in, or there isn't demand for our products. Really, what then can we do? Is there a remedy of force majeure? Unfortunately, the way courts have approached a force majeure situation in the past is that commercial hardship, commercial inconvenience, or inconvenience in general is not enough to trigger a force majeure claim. And that's something that we should be conscious of. Can we have the next slide? So some important points, and again, a question that is often asked is that, what are the things that we need to keep in mind when either invoking a force majeure claim or responding to one. So what we've tried to do is just, from experience, lay down some important points. I think the first one and the most important one is please follow the procedure that is laid down in the contract. If your contract requires you to invoke force majeure within a specified time period, it's important that we do that. If the contract requires us to provide evidence of the event, we should do that. Next important point is, I think, just be specific. Specificity is very important when you're claiming force majeure. Courts, as I've said before, will take a very narrow view of the matter, and it's important that you set out specifically the event, the force majeure event that you're referring to, and what is the obligation that is impacted. Because we have seen claims over the last few weeks, which are very, very vague and general. There is COVID-19; it's an epidemic. There is a disruption, and therefore we cannot perform. I don't think notices of that kind will be looked at very kindly by courts. So therefore, please be specific. Specificity is very, very important. And I think it goes without saying that, look, whilst most issues around force majeure and inability to perform will be resolved commercially, and hope better sense prevails and parties do resolve it commercially, there will be that 1% that we are seeing will get into litigation inevitably. And in litigation, correspondence, the content of your correspondence, timing of your correspondence is very important. So please do start maintaining records. Please correspond carefully. And what you put in that correspondence, I think, is of vital importance and may determine the outcome of a litigation should you face one going forward. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned in the beginning, you could have a situation where there is no force majeure clause in your contract, and that's really where Section 56 of the Indian Contract Act may come into play. Section 56 of the Indian Contract Act really encapsulates what is commonly referred to as the doctrine of frustration. And what Section 56 provides is that if after a contract is made, and simply put, if after a contract is made, it becomes impossible or unlawful for the parties to perform their obligations under the contract is void. A contract becomes void. So that's really the sum and substance of Section 56. But one key point I think one needs to understand and be conscious of is that the threshold for invoking Section 56 is very, very high. As you can see, you will have to demonstrate impossibility or illegality, and really impossibility of permanent nature. And at least the jurisprudence in India, case laws in India today are very clear that 56 threshold is extremely high, and really in the rarest of rare cases will a party be permitted to invoke Section 56. And that's really something to be careful about, because it's not as if in every case where there is no force majeure clause, you can automatically turn to Section 56. If you're temporarily unable to perform, Section 56 may not be your recourse. But having said that, it's a provision that is available, and one should look at it and be conscious of it in the current times. Next slide, please. So lastly, what are the consequences of invoking force majeure frustration? Very important, because as I said, we should be conscious when we are invoking force majeure, because if we are not successful in in our claim, we could potentially face a monetary exposure in the form of damages claim, or we could even face operational exposure in the form of, say, a claim for specific performance. So before we decide not to perform our obligation and seek excuse under the garb of force majeure or frustration, it's important to understand the consequences. Having said that, if we do succeed in making a claim of force majeure, then really if my claim is one under the contract, under the force majeure clause, the outcome will depend, the consequences will depend on the language of the contract. So your contract may allow delayed performance, your contract may provide for deferment of obligations, or potentially your contract may also provide for termination after a specified time. In case of frustration, as I mentioned before, the contract really comes to an end. And that's the key difference between a successful invocation of a force majeure clause and a frustration. Um, Finally, in my final slide, um, can we move to the next one? So I think there is a jurisprudence, COVID-19 jurisprudence, as we would like to describe it, that is developing. Historically, we have seen courts have taken a narrow view of the matter. Courts will prefer giving effect to the parties' bargain. Courts will expect parties to perform, and very rare cases will the court uphold a claim for force majeure or frustration. But having said that, I think we are in unprecedented times, and really not something anybody here in the audience or otherwise would have envisaged, and really a reflection of that comes forth clearly in the government actions that we've seen. So we've seen the Ministry of Finance coming forward and issuing advisories and stating that in the context of public procurement contracts, force majeure lockdown will be treated as a force majeure. We've seen the Ministry of Shipping coming out with similar advisory. We've seen Ministry of Renewable Energy doing the same. Ministry of Rail and Road as well has clarified that a force majeure can be invoked in the prevailing circumstances. So unprecedented times. We've had the Supreme Court of India really pass an order that we've never seen before on 23rd March, where limitation period was extended across the board for all proceedings in India. Again, something unprecedented. And really, two judgments also have, or orders have really been passed over the past few weeks, one by the Bombay High Court and one by the Delhi High Court. Bombay High Court was a judgment where really the force majeure claim was rejected because that was an attempt made to sort of avoid payment against supply of certain goods from an offshore supplier. And the court really concluded that, look, this is not something that's covered under the force majeure clause. The force majeure clause is not invocable in the present circumstances. Also, that was a case where it involved the steel industry, and the court said that, look, steel manufacturing plants being exempt. Also, for that reason, the court rejected the application. And finally, there was an issue also of invocation of an LC in that case. And the court really said that, look, LC is an independent contract, and therefore no injunction can be granted. So really a judgment that was by and large on point, by and large consistent with the jurisprudence around force majeure. The Delhi High Court judgment, I thought, was slightly on a different footing. And there it was a case where a party sought an injunction against invocation of a bank guarantee by a principal. The party who applied for the injunction was the contractor who had furnished a bank guarantee. And really a very interesting judgment, because the Delhi High Court has gone ahead and said that the lockdown constitutes a force majeure event, and therefore on that ground really granted an ad interim injunction. But I should caution everybody that, look, both these orders are ad interim orders, and before we really rely on these orders as precedents, we should be conscious that most cases, if not all, will be decided on the facts and circumstances of each case, and therefore too much reliance on these judgments may not be appropriate. Having said that, it does sort of provide some sort of guidance going forward in how courts may deal with a force majeure situation. So that's a general overview, and I think I'll now request my partner Harsh to really shed some light on the real estate aspects of force majeure. And of course, at the end of the presentation, I'll be happy to take questions from the audience. Thank you. Over to you, Harsh.
May I request participants to write the questions in Q&A?
Thank you, Kingshuk. And Paras, can we move to the next slide, please? Yeah, next slide, please. So from a real estate perspective, we will look at, in this slide, we will look at commercial leases, leave-in licenses, business conducting agreements, and RERA agreements. These are the three main contracts under real estate which we will dwell upon on this slide. So as Kingshuk mentioned, force majeure as a concept is a contractual concept And therefore, it is important to look at each of your contracts first to see what is, whether at all force majeure clause is incorporated or envisaged. Then it is also important to see what does force majeure cover. So any leave-in license or a lease, we'll get into the distinction on which law applies a little later. But at least on the contract principally, it is important to understand as to what is it that it entails. Many real estate leave-in license or lease documents only envisage a scenario where property is destroyed or damaged because of any force majeure event such as a flood or a tsunami or act of God or war. Most of the agreements are of that nature, and therefore today's pandemic, which the COVID-19 pandemic would not fall under the definition of force majeure if you have a restrictive definition which only deals with damage or destruction. Another set of contracts which deal generally with words such as if because of a force majeure events which include a statutory order or a government order, it renders the property unfit or inhabitable. Many are taking a view that the terms inhabitable or unfit means that I am unable to use. Now, this kind of, if you have a clause of this nature, it's important to look at the consequences of force majeure. Most of these clauses will have a clause later on which says that once the property is now rendered fit, or the licensor or the lessee has done acts to render it fit, the licensee or lessee can come back and use and occupy. That presupposes that there has to be some damage or some issue with the property and not a simpliciter lockdown which has rendered you unable to access the premises. And therefore it is critical to look at each of these clauses. Also, what is important to understand, if there is a force majeure clause, what is the consequence? Does it lead to suspension of payment of license fee or lease rent, or does it directly lead to a termination if a force majeure continues for a continuous period of 30 days or 60 days? Therefore, if there is a question, if there is a clause which leads you to direct termination, then you need to tailor your responses to your landlords or to the lessees or the licensees or the licensors in a manner as a request more than a contractual right that you would want to suspend payment. And therefore consequences of force majeure under a document is also extremely important. Now, if you as a lessee or a licensee are under the essential services which are allowed to work by the government and are exempted from the lockdown, even if there is a force majeure which applies, which says that if you are unable to access premises, and if for your own reasons, because you have no employees coming in or you want to be extra cautious and not work, you cannot raise a force majeure alarm and say that I want to suspend my obligation of payment, because there is no embargo on you and you out of your own choice have decided not to open the property and use. Also, as King Shuk mentioned, financial hardship or commercial inability cannot be a reason to not pay. For example, if you have a merchandise shop and there has been your goods are lying there and you are unable to sell, that cannot be a reason that you will say that I have zero revenue, I will not pay. So therefore commercial inability cannot be a reason to call in a force majeure. If there is a clause which talks about only and only the fact that you are unable to use property, and if it does not go ahead to say that you are unable to run business from the property, there has been a lot of talk around this, that whether the fact that your papers are lying in the office, your servers are working, your laptops are there, or your hardware is there, that itself presupposes and means that the lessee or the licensee is in use of the property and therefore they cannot take advantage of the force majeure clause. Now, we've also seen that Software Technology Parks of India has yesterday announced that they will waive off rents for the 4 months from March to June for 60 locations around India. MIDC has done that they've not, there in the MIDC, they've not waived off rents, they've deferred rental payments and they've given breathers of 3 months for the lessees to pay up the rent. Many private developers have gone ahead and voluntarily allowed deferment of rent, but not complete waivers. Now we'll have to look at if your contract does not envisage a force majeure clause, then what applies? Therefore, it is critical to understand whether you have a lease or a license. Because in case of a lease, the law which applies in case of a lease is the Transfer of Property Act and not the Indian Contract Act, and this is the settled jurisprudence for over the last 50 years. And therefore, if your contract of a lease, the lease deed is silent on force majeure, then the only act which applies is Section 108 of the Transfer of Property Act. Now, therefore, if your lease deed is silent, Section 108 Transfer of Property Act, the threshold is very high. It only talks about damage or destruction to property and no suspension of rent in case of incapability of use of the property. And therefore, unless and until your property is damaged or destructed, you cannot invoke provisions of Section 108 under a lease document. Similarly, in case of a leave-in license, the act which applies there is the Contract Act and Section 56. However, the present COVID situation to fall under the provision of Section 56 of the Contract Act may be too hard, because the reason the Section 56 can be only invoked is only in case of an impossibility to perform, which is of such a nature which goes to the root or the crux of the contract and renders the contract void. Therefore, in a 5-year leave-in license or a lease, a 2-month gap of inability to use may not stand the test of Section 56 and impossibility of performance. We've also seen on residential, Government of Maharashtra come out with circulars saying do not charge rent for 3 months, do not go for eviction. Now, even in residential properties, one cannot invoke force majeure because you are already in use and occupation, and commercial hardships cannot mean that you are unable to pay. The advisory come out by the Government of Maharashtra can at best be a request or an advisory and not a direction. So therefore, that is also important to look at. And lastly, we look at force majeure under RERA. If you are a customer who bought flats under RERA, this again, commercial inability, loss of job, or loss of payment cannot mean that you will stop paying, because under RERA, Maharashtra government, Karnataka RERA, Tamil Nadu and many other states have come out with suo moto circulars extending the validity of the registration and the timelines to hand over the property. And therefore, as an allottee or as a purchaser, you will be unable to defend a case that because the property I was supposed to be getting it by March 2020 and I'm going to now getting it by say December 2020, I will want to renege from the contract and terminate. That may not hold good. And therefore, even under RERA, one needs to be careful and this is for termination, etc., to see that there is extension and you should not refrain from sending those notices. And we'll just look at quickly the last example on the slide. Parasway, if you can just move to the slide before this. If you have a slide like, if you have an illustration like this, which for the first illustration talks of demolition and destruction, there even the words pandemic, epidemic are used. But what it means is that only if the property is demolished or destructed, this clause can apply. Therefore, in the present COVID situation, you cannot invoke under the first illustration. If you look at the second illustration, though the words pandemic, epidemic are not used, but there's a generic term which says that if the premises cannot be used for a continuous period of 50 days for any reasons beyond control of parties, then the licensee is entitled to suspend payment of license fees. Even here, if the words pandemic, epidemic are not used, the generic words beyond control of parties is good enough for you to invoke this and seek a waiver of payment of license fees. With this, I think we can move on with Anshul on the employment part.
Thank you, Harsh, and thank you, the Chamber of Tax Consultant team, Paras Bhai, Rahul, and others for this opportunity. I think one of the most crucial points which have arisen in the last couple of months is in relation to the issues which employers across sectors, across industries have been facing in respect of workforce management issues. Now, it is easy for some of the sectors to really talk about employees who are able to work from home, but largely from the perspective of those establishments which are unable to really have their employees reporting remotely and contributing to the company's business. The question arises, and I think I'm being mindful of the time, and to quickly browse through some of the key elements which have arisen in the past in respect of how we have been advising our clientele across sectors. I will emphasize upon those important points at this stage. One of the most important aspects which I see is in relation to potential reduction in salaries, rationalization of wages, and how far it is feasible, given the fact that you have various advisories from appropriate governments across the state. There is an order from the Union Home Ministry of 29th of March, and a couple of other elements which are in relation to continuous operations. And once the lockdown is lifted, and looking at the possibility of 3rd of May being the benchmark, how far we can really look at the perspective of opening up by looking at the standard operating procedures which have been prescribed. So I think starting from the first point about the state advisories and Union Home Ministry order, the perspective which we have and which we have been taking so far is in relation to the migrant workers issue, which arose once we had heard about the steep humanitarian crisis which erupted in the country when the moment this lockdown was announced by the Prime Minister. Several migrant workers, people who are operating in one state as far as their assignments are concerned, and they have hometowns in another region of the country, started moving out on foot because largely the issue came up in respect of lack of public transport facilities, and that gave rise to a very critical issue of the very perspective of social distancing being defeated. And in that backdrop, the Union Home Ministry issued this order to the state chief secretaries. Now, from the overall standpoint, the one para which actually gave rise to the confusion in the minds of the industry players is that it does say salaries cannot be curtailed. You have to pay the full salary to all the employees. But if you look at the 30th March judgment in Alak Srivastava case, which was issued by the Supreme Court, that has emphasized on the aspect of migrant workers instead of looking at the Union Home Ministry order in totality and having the overall perspective of supplanting the other labor laws of this country. Moving on from that, and of course there is another writ petition filed by Nagrika Exports before the Supreme Court, which is yet to come up, yet to be heard. But overall perspective is that this is about migrant workers. This is about those workers who have been engaged through contractors on the premises, belonging to other states, falling in the manual worker category, for whom there are certain specific details which have been set out by the Union Home Ministry and the appropriate governments. Moving on from that, the other question would be whether the Disaster Management Act is going to supplant the applicable labor laws in this country when it comes to the process you can follow pertaining to rationalization of wages and even potential termination of workforce. The first bit which I would like to mention very quickly here, that from an overall perspective, Disaster Management Act has a different legislative intent. And to the extent one would talk about the overriding impact on other existing laws, it is essentially from the standpoint where other existing laws and orders in this country or any state are insufficient to deal with the overall legislative intent of controlling or managing disaster. Now, I don't see any specific correlation between the very objective of Disaster Management Act and the payment of wages and industrial relations perspective, which is already covered by applicable labor laws in this country. And when I'm emphasizing on labor laws of the state or at the union level, I'm first emphasizing on the non-managerial category, on the workman category of workforce, be it on the services sector, be it on the manufacturing side, because Industrial Disputes Act would equally apply to all the sectors. So let's first put aside the misnomer that if I'm an IT establishment, the Industrial Disputes Act will not apply to me, and I can take whatever action I want pertaining to salary reduction for my employees who fall in the non-managerial category. For managerial category also, you need to really reach out to the employees and try to make any proposition of wage reduction or salary reduction to the extent possible consensual. And of course, there will be objections from time to time, but in any event, express or implied consent of the employees would be necessary to ensure that no action on your part as management is deemed arbitrary. As far as the workforce, the workman is concerned, the first trigger in respect of legal provision would be about an advance 21 days notice to reduce salary. And it will be important for you to also consider what exactly would form the core constituent of wages. There could be some components, for example, shift allowance, something which is related to overtime payments, something which is related to commission pertaining to specific deliveries or client portfolio management. And when people are sitting remotely and not able to perform or not able to really deal with those specific conditions in respect of its fulfillment, we need to assess from a contractual as well as legal standpoint if at all a notice is required to at least hold off on those payments. So that is something which needs very careful assessment. But I thought it best to point it out to all of you that you need to consider these factors also. Common question, whether you can stop increments, whether you can defer promotions, whether you can curtail variable pay components at this stage during the lockdown period. My response will be yes, you can. Having said that, the communication would be key here. You need to reach out to your employees, make it absolutely clear in terms of building confidence, and also from the perspective of business continuity, that ultimately you are going to deal with the same workforce once the operations resume. So at least from the perspective of allaying any confusion and making it aptly clear on what you propose to do in terms of variable pay is equally important. And you need to be mindful of the overall perspective about variable pay should not be something which is in the nature of fixed allowance, which is ordinarily payable to an employee on, from time to time every year or every month. At least you need to have from a policy perspective some assessment as to whether such variable payments would be contingent upon performance of the employee, performance of the company, and overall business environment. So that is something which needs careful assessment. Another question which usually comes up, and it is also provided in the first slide, is about contract workers and whether it is really your liability to continue to pay wages to your contract workers, even if there is a period of non-deployment due to the current lockdown situation, or in a situation where you have surplus contract workforce, and because of the reduced headcount which is currently required to be deputed or deployed on your premises based on the current SOPs or guidelines from the Union Home Ministry, does the law make it mandatory for you as a principal employer to continue to pay wages? Now, I would also rely upon a very careful assessment of the contractual stipulation which may exist between you as a company and the service provider, that means the contractor or the manpower services provider. If at all it talks about any minimum wage payment or premium payments which may be applicable even during suspended services. However, I would like to also clarify that if a contract has already expired, let's say by 31st March 2020, it will not compel you, none of the advisories will compel you as a principal employer to automatically renew such contracts which have already expired on account of efflux of time. So from that perspective, one aspect is also about humanitarian approach, which several companies in various sectors have taken. They have indeed agreed with the contract worker that fair enough, we may be able to share some cost, but not the same money which we ought to pay to them in ordinary circumstances when they are actually deployed on our premises. So that is something which is more on a practical or humanitarian basis, which you need to be mindful of, which you can take as an approach, not the whole amount, but something which can be taken up as a subsistence allowance for the workers. Even for your regular employees, if at all we are looking at reduction in wages, I would like to also rely upon some current developments. There are several state governments who have emphasized on progressive ways of reducing cost and to keep the business afloat. Be it the state minister in Telangana, be it the state minister in Karnataka, several other ministers have been issuing those statements when they are holding talks with the industry players that don't get involved in immediate termination of your employees simply because there is COVID-19 backdrop. But of course, you can look at other options in terms of reducing the wages. such that you don't have to immediately look at headcount reduction as a step. One would also suggest that if at all you have any planned redundancies, if you're looking at termination of employees, especially at the workman level, then please try to have that rationalization exercise at least taken off post 3rd of May, or at least when the situation is under control to the extent possible. There are sensitivities involved. There are emotions which are running high. If at all possible, try to make it more amicable. Instead of shooting out notices to the employees that from so and so date, we are looking at a situation where your exit is imminent. So that is something which I would like to caution against, and that is what the labor authorities are frowning upon. Arbitrary actions on the part of the employers, that suddenly the employees would realize that on so and so date when they were expecting salaries in their account, there is either nothing or there is a very minute portion of it which is coming without any explanation being there from a communication standpoint. One question which keeps rising every now and then is about leave adjustment, whether we can ask the employees to go on leave without pay, whether we can compulsorily adjust leaves, is essentially from the perspective of whether it is allowed under the policy or otherwise. So we need to be mindful of the fact that leave entitlement is voluntary. You cannot force people to do that. Please be mindful that if you are trying to change a policy in respect of carry forward of leave while keeping the leave accumulation cap intact, even that is something which needs to be done in a proper disseminated manner. You need to reach out to the employees, because this is indeed an amendment to the terms and conditions of employment. You need to be mindful of the applicable terms which may exist in the extent shops and establishment legislations on National Festival and Holidays Act of a particular state. To that extent, we need to be also mindful of the fact that once you open up and once you follow the SOPs, and if at all there is any symptomatic employee who is found out on the workplace, although it is not your immediate liability to report, but looking at the sensitivities involved and the onerous provisions, you will be required to at least have appropriate processes in place to immediately respond to that situation and report the concerned employee to the nearest health quarantine center. In respect of the onerous provisions, specifically, there is a lot of news around it, and everybody is apprehensive that once we open up, and if there is a symptomatic employee who is found on our workplace, can I be prosecuted? And very recently, as early as just 2 or 3 hours before, when we are speaking currently, there's a clarification which has been issued on social media by the Ministry of Home Affairs that such provisions have been misinterpreted. Paragraph 21 and 22 from the MHA guidelines do talk about an onerous responsibility, but that is only when you fail to follow the SOPs and not just because an employee is found symptomatic once you resume operations. But of course, we need to see more clarity. There are difficulties in terms of overlapping of shifts being avoided, 1 hour gap in terms of continuous processes. What exactly is continuous process? You need to also be mindful of and tracking the containment zones, because the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare has issued separate directives to the states in this regard. So I think from an overall standpoint, the situation is very fluid. Don't take any specific action assuming that you can do it. Take appropriate advice. Be mindful of the sensitivities involved. Be prepared if at all you're going to be questioned by any competent authority on what you have done. Be prepared in respect of any documentation which may needed to be exhibited. If at all there is any question raised tomorrow, not just from a legal standpoint, but even internally, when an employee is questioning your stand. So I think with that, I would end this conversation. And if there are any questions, we can take it. Happy to address those.
Thank you all the 3 speakers for having a wonderful exposition of the knowledge. We have received a few questions. Let me take one by one. Well, can the force majeure can be applied if there is no destruction of property in lease agreement And Section 108 of TOPA talks about the destruction of property or premises being permanent unfit for the lease to be void for instance of lessee.
Yes. So for leased, unless the force majeure clause in your agreement allows you to suspend payment because of business interruption or inability to use the property, if that's specifically permitted, you cannot suspend payment. And if there is no force majeure clause in your lease, then 108 will not come to your rescue, because 108 only deals with damage and destruction and nothing else.
Another question is that what if the contract does not have the force majeure clause?
Yeah. So I think I mentioned that in the course of my presentation that look, it does become a bit of a challenge if you don't have a force majeure clause in your contract. And really, perhaps you would have to look at Section 56 to see if your case fits in under Section 56. Otherwise, I think as a worst case scenario, you may have to approach the court and really try and apply for some sort of equitable relief. But really, it does make your position challenging if you don't have a force majeure clause in your contract in the given circumstances.
Because if we see the OAS decision of Supreme Court in case of a Bangad or Aloki Prasad or that of Nehati, though these were rendered considering the Second World War, and probably in all those decisions they went on Section 56 and relief was not granted on those things.
Yes, yes, absolutely, Parasbhai. And really, Section 56 is a case where you will have to demonstrate complete impossibility. So if today, because of the lockdown or the epidemic, we are not able to temporarily fulfill our obligations under the contract, we may not be able to invoke Section 56. So that really is the difficulty.
Parasbhai?
Hello.
Let me check if Parasbhai is.
I think Harsh, Anshul, maybe you can look at the Q&A and there are some questions concerning it, property
we can answer those questions which are there on the Q&A block. Most of these are on damage, destruction, and whether rent can be suspended. So we just answered those there.
So I think a couple of questions which I see from employment law standpoint, and I can see first question which is in relation to an IT company serving notice on employees for termination. How valid is it to effect already enlisted pending terminations on the basis of performance or role redundancy during this phase? Whether possible, if yes, employer's obligation. So if I've understood the question correctly, it is about performance appraisals already being done, and the certain roles which have completely fallen off the radar, and there is no way the employees can be retained in the current circumstances. This is not about COVID-19, but it is about almost something which has transpired way before the entire perspective of COVID-19 came in. The response would be, it is possible. It is not that it is almost impossible for you to do so. But I would caution you against taking any steps which could result in an imminent exit of your employees, especially when I talk about non-managerial personnel, your people who fall in general staff or executive category, who are just following instructions. I'm not getting into the details of who is a workman and who is not, but at least from the perspective of ensuring that you have the requisite paper trail and bespoke material to demonstrate that it was indeed a non-performance or underperformance issue. Your performance appraisal process is not just viewed as a sham or a ploy to bring out the employees out of the system. So that is something you need to be mindful of. And to the extent you are able to demonstrate that there is an actual role redundancy, and tomorrow once the situation normalizes, it will not be the case that you as management are going to fill up the same position which you declared as redundant for a particular employee. So I think all those nuances have to be borne in mind before you initiate any steps. And yes, non-performance or underperformance as a ground for termination is not misconduct, which will take away the very rights of an employee to retrenchment compensation or severance compensation or notice pay. So please be mindful of those obligations which will accrue to you as an employer when you are really engaging yourself in an exercise which is ultimately resulting in employee exits. I think the second question is pertaining to existing laws to waive rent, etc. And Harsh, if you would like to cover that point.
Yes. So, in case if there is a question which says that if there's no force majeure clause in a license agreement, and if we don't pay, and if the landlord issues notices for arrears of license fee, can one invoke section 56? Now, if there's no force majeure clause in a leave-in license agreement, it is highly unlikely that under 56 any relief will be granted, because 56 talks of a complete impossibility to perform. In a leave-in license of a term of 5 years or more, a 2-month or a 1-month inability to use premises would not be treated as an impossibility to perform the entire agreement, and therefore 56 would not come to a rescue, and for suspension anyways 56 would not apply, and therefore there is no other choice as such, unless the contract provides otherwise, to renege from the position of paying license fee.
So I think next a very interesting question which has come up about another listed company, which whether it is possible to avoid honoring leave encashment obligations when the employment contract is silent, but HR policies allowed carry forward of 45 days of leave. When I say, I think I understand correctly, carry forward means accumulation of 45 days of leave. And can any of the labor laws be helpful to employee in this case? So the response is not just about relying on the employment contract, even the employment policies. And I would assume this is about Maharashtra. And I think the company, I would assume, would be falling within the ambit of a commercial establishment. And from that standpoint, to the extent the policy would provide in compliance with the applicable Shops and Commercial Establishments Act, it will not be legal, or I would say feasible, for the employer to deny such encashment requirement for the concerned employee just because the employment contract is silent about it. And let me tell you, even if the employment policy is silent about it, there could be a claim, and you need to really assess to what extent you have to comply, because it is up to 45 days. Contractually, it can be agreed to have a certain lesser number of accumulated leaves, but it cannot be said with utmost certainty that if you completely deny that right to an employee, you will be on the right side of the law, because provisions can be invoked under the law. And this is something which is an obligation which should not be denied to an employee. Another question is about deferment of salary as an option under MHA order 29th March, and how are companies in the aviation sector able to order pay cuts and deferments while the said order in force. So I think I've already explained our position and inputs on the efficacy of these orders, the Union Home Ministry order. One is about that being challenged and how it is going to be tested before the Supreme Court or competent high courts in the country. But the view is very clear. It is predominantly about migrant workers and their protection. In any event, as far as the information goes, this is all about arriving at some consensus with the employees. And let me tell you, from a human resource perspective, it's all about keeping the business afloat, retaining the people, and trying to mitigate your operating losses, as opposed to continue to pay wages and trying to shut the shop down. So ultimately, it is up to you to reach out to the employees, and that is what some of the companies have done. to do it in a more progressive manner, where it could be a more phase-wise percentage reduction of wages all across the board, trying to ensure that the lowest rung category is the least impacted and people right at the top are taking the maximum brunt of salary reduction. So this is more on the human resource side more than legal. But yes, even in case of any percentage reduction, the communication ought to be very clear. So this is how things have transpired, but one would not deny the fact that these actions have indeed been challenged. There have been notices or questions raised, but ultimately it is not the immediate intention of people to prosecute you as an employer, but to raise questions on how you have actually implemented such steps. So be mindful of that front.
Anshul, one query is that small CA firms and law firms who have less than 15 employees, can they pay less salary, or or are they also bound to pay the entire salary, even if like the Establishment Act, etc., strictly don't apply?
No, absolutely. I don't think MHA guidelines are making it mandatory for professional firms like us to, essentially keep paying those salaries. There is a difference here. First of all, we are professionals. We are not really falling squarely within the purview of Industrial Disputes Act. Some arguments may be there, but we don't have specific recourse to challenge, especially if we are reaching out to the employees and taking, deferment of salaries or salary haircut on a pan organization basis. So this is something which is very much doable, especially if you have a smaller workforce and people are taken into confidence. And given the situation, this is not something which will be deemed illegal in the current scenario. To the extent we are looking at least some subsistence on, or some specific cuts being allowed for employees all across the grades in your organization.
Another query is whether a BPO, can they lay off the employees as now no new projects or even the existing projects are not going on?
No, I think it is important to first understand what is layoff and what is retrenchment. Now, I will not rely on the Western jurisprudence, which means when you lay off people, they are permanently out of the system. And layoff as a concept under Industrial Disputes Act, under labor laws of this country, is essentially covering the aspect of temporary suspension of services. And under that scenario, the Supreme Court has not recognized the no work, no pay principle, which will apply to workmen or non-managerial employees in such cases. It has emphasized on the overall perspective of no work, some pay, or yet pay. So you can ask the employees not to report to work for the time being, and because of the lockdown situation, nothing is going to be assigned to you. And especially I'm talking from a BPO standpoint, you are not a factory, which can statutorily under the Industrial Disputes Act declare layoff as a condition and start paying layoff compensation, which is 50% of basic and DA, because that would apply only to factories, mines and plantations with 50 or more workmen at any point in time. But for a BPO, you can resort to salary reductions. You can resort to a more consensual approach where you can reduce salaries to some extent, making it more of a subsistence allowance, instead of talking about an overall perspective where you have employees not earning anything at all, and you are simply asking them to be in abeyance for the time being without any means of earning as far as the lockdown period is concerned. So be mindful of those sensitivities. And if at all you are looking at an advanced perspective, then you need to be mindful of the advanced notice period, which is prescribed under the applicable law, which you need to comply with if at all you don't need to approach or you don't want to approach the employees seeking their consent for such measures to be implemented amongst your workforce.
So shall I, there are a few hands which are raised. Shall I allow them to talk, Rahul?
Yeah, we can take live questions.
Live questions, okay. So I'm going to take in Mr. Apurva Bookseller first. So you can unmute your mic and start talking, Mr. Apurva, if you have any question. I think he's.
We can move to the other person.
Maybe next is Mr. Satish Patel. S.H. Subramanian.
Mics are mute.
No, so they have an option of unmuting. By default, it is on mute. I am unmuting them, but they are not. Then next is Mr. Ramananda Gowda Gowar. Sir, you've been.
Hello. Hello.
Yes.
Sir,
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, can you hear me, sir?
Yeah,
Yes.
you can speak your question.
Yes, sir. Sir, I have one query with regard to the consultancy fees. Regularly, we are paying month on month. Hello.
Sorry. Yes, sir. You can go ahead, please.
So regularly, month on month, people are paying to one advocate, and now this under the situation, but this pandemic thing also. So whether they can withhold these fees.
I think the question he's asking is he's making a month-on-month payment to.
No, I got the question. And I think I have kind of answered that question in one of the other, responses which I made about professional firms who are intending to reduce professional fee or retainership amounts, because I think almost everybody who is retained in these professional firms are raising invoices on a month-to-month basis. They are retained, being paid retainership fee, etc. So I don't see much of a problem. It is not absolutely mandatory for you, or it is not prohibited that you cannot reach out to the employees, the professionals in your firm to reduce consultancy fee payments. And more specifically, you are looking at a situation where during the lockdown, there will be a reduction in business, there will be reduction in revenue. It's all about reaching out to the employees and trying to build in confidence that we are deferring or we are holding off on the full payment of your consultancy fee. More specifically because it is a contract for service where it is the requirement for you to render certain services. And if at all we are looking at a situation where these services are not completely rendered, you may be asked to be there to continue to report to work from working from home. But it's all about reaching out to the employees and reducing it. So this is more of a contractual perspective rather than relying on the prohibition. If at all one could really differ from the Union Home Ministry order. So professionals per se will not be covered, but from a human resource standpoint, important for you to reach out and make it more effective as a communication before you take any unilateral step to reduce wages for or salaries for the employees, or a professional fee for your consultants or retainers.
Next.
Okay. So next would be Mr. Uday Vora. Sir, you can unmute yourself and ask question if you have.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes. Yes, sir, we can hear you. Please.
So thank you for the opportunity. So my question is specifically related to the co-working sector. Okay, so presently they are serving to n number of clients. Okay, and due to this COVID-19 situation, there have been cases, wherein the company could not use the premises at all, right from the start of the lockdown until the time the lockdown is not over. So this company is specifically, insisting on the non-payment of the rent and the initiation of the clause in FM. So how these are to be dealt with?
So Uday, in this case, right, you'll have to look at your service agreement or your co-working agreement you entered into with this co-working space, whether a situation of inability to use your property is covered in that. If it is, then you can suspend payment. If not, then unfortunately you would have to continue paying and there is no other way out.
Okay, next question. I'm allowing Mr. Vijay Savla to answer. ask a question. Sir, if you are here, you can ask question. You can unmute yourself and ask question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Question is, there is an establishment mall who are doing the trading with 200 employees. What stand they can take for the salary for this month's payment? Hello. Can you hear now?
Did you get the question?
No, it was, I think the voice was not very clear. So I could understand trading company and you have around 200 employees, but what was the question?
Salary. What stand they can take to make this reduced payment, salary reduced payment?
So it would depend on when you want to reduce it and what kind of salary or components you really want to really hold off on. Or is it about percentage cuts all across the wage constituents? And based on that, one needs to really assess if at all you need to reach out by way of a notice as required under the applicable law, which is minimum 21 days. Or if you are looking at an implied or express consent from the employees for a wage reduction. So the point would be you cannot force it, whether it is COVID-19 or otherwise. You cannot just tell the employees that you have to take salary cut. The only perspective would be if you do it more involuntarily, there's a possibility that employees may approach the labor authorities and raise some issues. And then you will have to demonstrate how far you have been able to reach out to the employees and what are the specific reasons when you didn't have the time enough to explain your stand in respect of any implementation which you wanted to propose on the salary reduction aspect. So there's no straightforward answer in terms of what you need to do in respect of different structures which may be there for your employee salaries and what you can reduce and what not. But yes, you have to follow some processes, and to the extent you are within that domain, it is something which cannot be immediately subjected to legal scrutiny from a Disaster Management Act or labor law standpoint.
Okay, next I'm going to allow Mr. Vivek Daswani to ask question. Sir, if you are here, please unmute.
Yeah. So am I audible? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, hi. I have a question for Anshul. Anshul, it's more of a technical question. Yeah. As most of the companies really don't want to retrench or terminate, but many are contemplating layoff. I heard you when you said, the concept is different in India and elsewhere. Now, layoff, I know for factories, it's squarely covered under the Industrial Disputes Act. But as far as shops and establishment goes, it's the model standing orders which you look at. So my question is more for Maharashtra, under the earlier Shops and Establishment Act, which got repealed in 2017, there was clearly a section 38B, 38A, where payment of wages, employee compensation, and standing orders was made applicable to all shops and establishments. That section does not appear under the new Shops and Establishment Act. So my question is, do the layoff provisions under the standing orders continue to apply to all shops and establishments in Maharashtra?
Yes, I'm aware of that ambiguity which exists, but we also need to be, I would say, we need to rely on Section 12A of Industrial Employment Standing Orders Act. Simply by virtue of the fact that it does not immediately repeal the application of model standing orders to apply to you. If you have not really looked at from the perspective of commercial establishment being covered specifically under the applicable SNE Act. And we continue to take that position that even if it is not specifically spoken about, we will apply the doctrine of repugnancy, where it is very clear that if unless and until there is a specific provision which is taking the establishment out of the ambit of standing orders, we will continue to apply Payment of Wages Act and standing orders to commercial establishments in Maharashtra. So to the extent your standing orders or the model standing orders are covering you, and these specific aspects are covered in terms of layoff or shutdown on account of epidemic, and still take recourse under those standing orders to the extent possible, unless and until there is anything which has changed from a certified standing order standpoint, wherein you have been in abrogation of what the model standing orders from a minimum standpoint would provide for. So that is something one needs to assess, but my answer would be yes, you can rely on the model standing orders for Maharashtra to look at these provisions for minimum payments to the employees.
Okay, so next I'm going to take Miss Chandni. Miss Chandni, if you are here, please unmute yourself and ask question.
Hi, I wanted to continue on that co-working query. So my query is, if my agreement says that we are paying rent for access to the premises, and they have specifically sent us the mail that we are closing down the center completely from 1st April till the lockdown is over. So can they still force us to pay the rent?
So what happens here is, Chandni, honestly, is that you cannot hold the landlord responsible for closing down, because if they don't, they are also penalized under the Disaster Management Act. And it is not an act, if you look at that clause of what you are referring to about keeping it open, if you were essential service and you had to go out to your premises and work, and then if they still don't keep it open, then yes, you can go and sue them and say that you're not allowing me access. But if you are not essential service, and if they have closed it down because of an order of the government, then there is no reason that you can go to them and say that because you are not keeping it open, I will not pay license fee, unless your contract so specifically says so, that your payment of the service charge or whatever fee that you pay to the co-worker is only because dependent upon him keeping the property available.
Okay, so next is going to be Mr. Manoj Wadhwa. I'm going to allow him to speak.
Yeah, hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity. So we have commercial tenants who are seeking waiver of rent as they are stating that the commercial premises rendered unfit for use. But, we are confused as to, is the premises actually rendered unfit for use because they have access to the premises, they have their representatives coming in and the servers are working, and, that server being on permits them to work from home. So we just wanted to clarify, is it actually rendered unfit for use?
So Manoj, that's a great question, and this is what's happening all around. Yet, no, it's not rendered unfit for use, unless and until your contract so specifically says that unless the licensee is unable to access premises or conduct business from the premises, if these are the words, only having unfit for use will not help any of your licensees or lessees. It's just a way of kind of negotiating with you to not pay the license fee. You can very well take a position that this is not unfit and servers are working, etc., and the property stands absolutely fit for use.
Okay, great. So now this is the last question from Mr. Chetan Dhabalia. Sir, I'm allowing you to talk. Please ask your question. Are you here? Mr. Chetan Dhabalia?
We can take Mr. S.H. Subramaniam.
Okay. There was some background noise in his case last time when we had asked him to speak.
Or some other person.
Okay, 1 second. Sir, Subramanian sir.
Yeah. Can you hear me, please?
Yes.
Yeah. My question is, if we are already issued a termination notice, partially because of COVID-19 issue, lockdown, and partially because of non-performance of some people, during this Disaster Management Act, during the lockdown period, what will happen? It means, should I withdraw it and reissue after the lockdown period is over? Or say that, the actual termination will take place only after the lockdown period is over?
Oh, so, Mr. Subramaniam, if we understood your query correctly, you are saying that if you are saying...
Can I repeat, please?
Yeah, you can go ahead.
We have already issued a termination notice to some people because we are service-oriented people. Okay, now what we should do? Should we withdraw it and reissue after the lockdown period is over? Or can we say that the actual termination will take place only after the lockdown period is over?
So, Mr. Subramaniam, Anshul here, and I would take this question on two different perspectives. One is about nothing compels you to really withdraw that termination notice. Even if you are talking about Disaster Management Act and all those orders being there, because this is an administrative prerogative, and you must have invoked the necessary notice provisions in the employment contract. And I'm not getting into the details of what nature of employment it would be, whether these are managerial personnel or otherwise. But you need to be also mindful of the fact that ultimately it is about transition of responsibilities, at least handing over of certain company properties, how you're going to do all that to ensure that, ultimately it is a possibility and the logistical issue which may come up. Even if you, let's say, have a release date for that employee or last date at employment during the lockdown period, whether it will be possible for any employee to hand over any equipment which he may carry with him, which may have been allotted by the company. And to that extent, one may have very clear communication that date of release may be extended only for the purposes of handing over of property. But when it comes to the last date of employment, unless and until you want to really defer the offboarding of that concerned employee because of the lockdown situation, it is not something which makes it mandatory for you to extend the notice period unnecessarily. So you can have separate dates for from the perspective of handover of properties or transition of responsibilities, depending on when the normalcy is going to be resumed. But it is not something which would compel you to extend the notice period. So that is fine. You can continue to have the employee on notice, but please be mindful of the fact that don't curtail the notice which payment which will accrue to that employee during this period. Don't say that I'll reduce the notice pay for you because of the lockdown period. That is something because it accrues from the employment contract of that employee. So please be mindful of those situations if at all you are considering any action on that front.
All right. So this is end of all the live questions.
There is one hand.
Is it? 1 second. It must be just now. Okay. Yes. 1 second.
Last question.
Yes. The last question. Miss Rashmi Jha, please unmute yourself and ask any question if you have.
Hi. Rashmi here. We can't hear you. I would like to ask something to Anshul. A question. Hello. Hello.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hello. Hello.
Hello. Can you hear me now?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes. Better now.
Yeah, I would like to ask something to Anshul. Anshul, I have some friends. I'm from BPO. Okay, I have some friends those who are working in HR. I got to know that they are not laying off the employees, but then what they have done, they have paid the minimum wages to them and then asked them to be at home. Some of the employees are working from home. They are paying 50% or 100% to them as per their requirement. My question is, since my lot of clients have taken off the contract due to COVID-19, and we are not in a position to pay all the employees. Like strength has become not even the 50%; it has become 25%. Like earlier we were 500 people. 85 people is working. So can we reduce the salary for those who are not working? They don't have the PCs or laptops. And is there any legal obligation to pay them full salary?
No, absolutely. As I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, that several state governments are trying to impress upon the industry not to terminate the services, keep the business afloat by applying progressive measures, that you at least pay them some sustenance allowance, some payments which is at least giving them an opportunity to sustain themselves, but not the full salary. And you may also look at any surplus payments which are being made, which are specifically contingent upon fulfillment of certain requirements. And for example, travel concession or traveling allowance, LTAs, something which is specifically related to an employee being able to commute to work and reporting to work actually. So that is something you need to really assess. But I would say from that standpoint, you need to clearly convey that message as to why it is happening and what are exactly the requirements because of which you are taking these steps. Not to say that immediately something is implemented and employees are kept in the dark. So don't take immediate unilateral action. Reach out to the employees, tell them very clearly, and have an endorsement, at least in that communication from the employee side, that this is what we propose to do in comparison of taking radical steps to completely do away with your services. So I'm saying that, as I emphasized, Supreme Court has also laid stress on the point that no work, no pay as a concept can only be applied when an employee fails to work for reasons attributable to him. But if there are reasons which are not attributable to him, you have to make some payments as opposed to making the full payment which you ordinarily pay to the employee. So if somebody is not working from home, you can agree on making some payments which are commensurating with the minimum wage requirement or some minimum percentage of salaries, but not the whole salary. That's a more balanced approach one can look at.
Okay, so the live questions are done.